Hi, folks. I'm Conrad Carnegie, editor and CEO of Santos Books. My guest today is John Yoder. John is a new author with Santos Books and has just published a book entitled Between the Odyssey of an Amish Boy or an Amish Boy's Odyssey. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Good to be here.
John, where'd this book come from? The idea of this book. What's its origins for you? Why write the book?
Well, the book is a kind of tries to find the general arc of my professional, well, not professional life only, but my life going from childhood, early childhood, all the way to my retirement. Um, and I have for years kind of resisted, I think, in some ways, the idea of writing a memoir, which this is. But I was struck one day, probably a year and a half ago, sitting with our children. We have three and four grandchildren, spouses as well. And we began talking about this for some reason. And they said, Dad, we'd really like for you to do this. And I said, Really? And they said, Yes. And so that's kind of how it got started. And maybe just to bring that to a conclusion in a way. Um, Recently, the book having been released now, we were together with our family, the same group basically, and they were involved in the writing, the editing, and some of their ideas are in there. But they said to me, Dad, thank you. This is a gift.
Oh, John, that's touching. That's moving. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing the book because I think what we discovered is, and what you discovered perhaps, uh, maybe it took you some time, was that there really is an author in there also. There's a story, but there's an author. And so you wrote a wonderful story, a delightful story, a descriptive story, a rich story of your childhood through adulthood, through older life. And yet you wrote it well and you wrote it with interest I work with so many authors to show, not tell. You did a great job of showing your story, not just telling, not just describing your story. What did you find most meaningful about writing, John, and discovering what you discovered as you wrote?
It was a surprisingly, to me, somewhat surprisingly therapeutic, maybe if that's the right
Mm.
word, experience in going back and just kind of systematically working my way, thinking my way through uh, what has gone on all these years before, looking particularly for a kind of arc, a meaningful arc from the beginning to a kind of logical end. And that discovering that, which I think I did to some extent, was very meaningful. But I also realized that much of my personal and then later professional life centered around the notion of identity and of where I fit, where one fits into the world in which one is immersed. So it's kind of a who am I throughout, though not explicitly stated, but throughout the books, the question of so where do I belong? Having grown up Amish, but moved out of those circles, it was tempting and many times felt as though I didn't really belong there because the world I had come from no longer I no longer had a birthright citizenship, so to speak, in that world. But I wasn't sure that I fit into the other world either because
Mhm.
the passages I had come through were just so different.
And you tried a number of those worlds. One of the very, very, I think, fascinating things about your story is how many different worlds you've lived in, and how many different worlds you describe. Worlds with different landscapes, worlds with different cultures, worlds with different people and customs. Uh, could could you say a little bit more about that journey, John, that you had?
Yes, really. And you're right. The leaving the Amish world in which I grew up. Immediately after that, I spent a couple of years in almost total isolation, you could say, from civilization in the northwest woods of Ontario, cut off from, in some ways, working in a school there, so there were people around me, but That was certainly removed from the world I had known. Later found myself in southern Africa, country of Botswana specifically, and then from there to California for some years, and then to Kansas for some years. So interestingly enough, not by design, but Kansas was the state in which I was born. My parents moved away. Of course, I went with them when I was 2 years old. Then I found myself career-wise back in Kansas after many years, and it was very interesting to as I look back across all of those places, so different. And yet I think they did each, the topography, the landscape, the people, each of whom were so different, impacted me in many ways. And yet I didn't really belong there either. And so it was always this question of here I am, where do I belong?
Peter Berger talks about us being producers of our worlds and products of our worlds, and that you were one who was able to be both so vividly in these different places. You were products of your Amish childhood, then you brought that out, took that into different places. You received from those places, you poured out into those places. John, how did you find it to write this book? What was the process? Was it difficult? Was it challenging? Was it easy? I'm thinking of people who might have grandchildren like yours who say, Grandpa, would you write your story? And someone says, I can't write. Well, how was the process for you, and why would you encourage others to consider it, John?
Well, it's first of all, as a professional in higher education for many, many years, I did a lot of writing, but
Mhm.
that was a different kind of writing.
Yeah.
This was a personal kind of writing, and uh, quite different, necessarily so, I think, from the professional writing that I had done. Um, but I found that once I began telling the story began telling itself. People have asked me, seeing the manuscript or the finished product, so did you do research to write this? And my answer is no, very little, because it really grew out of my own experience and
Hmm.
what I had experienced, what I had felt. And so it turned out to be a rewarding experience, though at times uh, took a certain level of discipline to get back to the computer and to do writing. But it was in the end, it felt good.
John, why do you think your grandchildren thanked you for writing this, so they're your story?
Well, probably because it helps them know who they are.
Yeah.
And and I'm convinced, of course, though I can't prove this very well scientifically, I'm convinced that we carry the germs, if you will, of where we've been and who we are from many generations back. There's I call it a socio-cultural DNA that we just inherit and we don't even know it, but it's there. And I think for grandkids and speaking for myself as a grandchild, um, that's an important piece of finding out who I am and where I fit into the world.
I'm also intrigued as a rural sociologist, John, with the way you've been engaged in the landscapes, how landscapes form us. And we're not just social beings, but we connect with our local environments, our biological environments. Uh, so I've appreciated just the kind of holistic approach you brought to your writing, the style you brought. It's been fun to engage with you. And could you say, just as we close, a little bit about the authors group that you're part of as you wrote?
Yeah, I do believe the landscape shapes us, and that was why, both because I love being outdoors. I didn't mention it in the book particularly, but as an adult, I became pretty serious about a hobby of photography,
Hmm.
landscape photography, particular landscape and
Hmm.
wildlife, which is a way of connecting with the environment.
Sure.
And I just
Sure.
today, in fact, Conrad, I had lunch with an elderly first cousin who grew up in Kansas. He later got a PhD and moved to Pennsylvania, spent years as a college professor. But I asked him, so what impact did your growing up in Kansas have on you? Did that landscape impact you in any way? He
Mm.
said, "Oh, yes." And he went on to recount the various ways that he was convinced that the topography, the landscape, the open spaces of Kansas had a direct impact on who he is and how he sees the world.
Thank you, John. I just say to those who are listening, John has been a very engaged and interesting author. He's been a support to other authors. We meet on Monday evenings as an authors group, and John has been very active and will continue that role with us. So thank you, John, for what you brought to Santa's books. Thank you for what you brought to this book and for what you've contributed and for being on this conversation today.
Thank you, Conrad. Thanks for asking me, and I have appreciated the role that you and the authors that are working with Santas have had. It's been a good experience.
Thanks, John. Blessings. Bye.
Thank you.